everyone. Part two of the book that I'm starting to read now. It's Gods of the Bible by Mauro Biglio. And just to share with you, I skipped over reading the introduction to you guys and also the discourse on method. I skipped over that part and just dived directly into the short, long story of the Bible on page 23. So today will be part two. I'm going to continue reading, and this is on page 29. This one is pretending, or number three. It's number three, as you can see here. It says pretending the Bible is true. So join me as I read the next section. Pretending the Bible is true. As seen, when it comes to the Bible, we are only left with copies of copies of copies of missing original archetypes that possibly reported ancient oral stories lost in the fog of time. Thus, the Bible is one of the most uncertain and fragile books that ever existed in the world. However, theologians have built on its very elaborate religious and dogmatic worldviews. During the millennia, their painstaking work has given rise to the three religions of the book. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism comprise more than 4 billion people, in fact 4.3 billion people. More than half of humanity bases their existence and their life values directly or indirectly on the Bible. This book has thus become the fulcrum and the heart of a complex power structure. Anyone can see how pivotal it is that these religious systems, however different, varied, and contradictory, be founded on solid ground, capable of supporting the monstrous and hypertrophic power system that grew on them. Nevertheless, these guardians of the orthodoxy are often afraid that the foundation of this power structure is not as solid as they hoped. For this reason, the Catholic Church forbade Bible reading unless under the guidance of the preacher for centuries. Looking at the big picture, we realize that an immense power structure was built on top of an unstable foundation. Monotheism is today a giant with feet of clay. The text on it which relies is the frailest thing in the world. One would expect theologians, believers, and Bible translators to avoid even touching the text, let alone changing it. Instead, they feel incredibly comfortable altering it at will, as will become apparent from many examples in the following chapters. Those who study translation as a discipline know that every translation is, to some extent, an interpretation, which is especially true of ancient text. However, this is no license for arbitrary translations. Some translations are acceptable or questionable, while others are downright wrong. One of the best translation practices is to leave controversial or uncertain words untranslated to avoid all sorts of problems and misunderstandings. Some translations currently seen and read in the publicly available Bibles are wrong or distorted. There are many such examples, as we will learn about some of them in this book. When translating, like classical musicians that train to get as close as possible to perfection, we have to make an effort to detach ourselves from our ideological background, which would require a certain degree of self-awareness. As the inscription of Apollo in Delphi suggest. Know thyself. When approaching the Bible, theologians and believers are anything but detached from their conception of God. Instead of striving for objectivity, they deliberately overlay the ancient text with their own views. The Bible text is far from the culture and intellectual millennia in which the Western conception of God took place. Instead of correcting themselves when necessary, they fix the Bible. Theologians and religious translators should refrain from changing the text and falsifying it when it goes against their beliefs, as they do to provide an example with the word olam, regularly translated with eternity in the Bible. Ancient Hebrew dictionaries clearly explain that olam does not mean eternity. Eternity in itself is a concept alien to the Bible. This is a fine example that well explains how theologians use modern concepts, or at least theological concepts dear to them, to overwrite the biblical text. Not in one instance does the word olam mean eternity in the Bible, and yet it is translated with eternity all the time. A similar case is the word kavod, which is translated with the word glory, but does not mean glory. Other terms such as ruach or Elohim, to which we dedicate the following chapters, have also been attributed wrong meanings that reflect the monotheistic will to superimpose a specific religious view. In sum, every time a biblical passage does not seem to confirm the theologian's concept of God, they feel comfortable forcing a translation into the text or resorting to allegorical meanings aimed at fixing the contradiction from a monotheistic perspective. This approach is entirely anachronistic and anti-scientific, yet does not raise eyebrows within the academic environment. When approaching an ancient text, we are like archaeologists on the field. We must be aware that before we get into any finding, we must remove strata of the dirt with a brush and a trowel. Many layers of earth and dirt have been deposited for centuries on the site we're excavating, and we need to remove them before we can get to the object of our study. In the same way, when we approach the Bible, we must know that there are more than 2,000 years of dirt deposited on this delicate object, on this highly fragile text. The thick theological incrustation deposited on the Bible for more than 2,000 years prevents us today from reading it for what it is, an amazing piece of ancient literature that could contain extraordinary truths about our past. The thick theological incrustation deposited on the Bible for more than 2,000 years prevents us today from reading it for what it is, an amazing ancient literature that contains extraordinary truths of our past. I read that already. It is about that time that humanity retrieves this wonderful book. The task is not easy because, as we said before, the Bible has become the foundation of an invertebrate power structure that affects the religious, but also the ethical, political, and economic sectors. To do so, however, we challenge the theologians on their ground, taking seriously their claim that the Bible text contains the truth. In fact, we consider the Bible true in its literal meaning. We do not assume that redactors, authors, of the biblical text represented their own ideas or the facts and events they intended to convey and describe. We believe that the Bible authors always told the truth as they saw it, even when they represent Yahweh as a violent individual who orders the extermination of women and children, or when, to give another example, they tell the story of Yahweh claiming for himself 675 sheep, 72 cattle, 61 donkeys, and hear this, 32 virgins, Numbers 31, chapters 31, 32 through 32 through 40, after the battle against the Midianites. Hang on a second. Okay. This part of the booty was not intended for the service of the tabernacle, as explained clearly in Numbers 35, but for Yahweh himself, that is, for him personally. One only wonders what a spiritual and transcendental God needed 32 virgins for. Such descriptions and disturbing passages were not intended as metaphors or allegories, but accurately represented what the writer had heard or seen. Similar examples are found everywhere in the Bible. Believers and theologians have trouble with examples that show Yahweh in a bad light, like a violent, jealous, narcissistic, vengeful, bad-tempered, irascible, and manipulative individual. Similar descriptions of Yahweh are endless in the Bible, and theologians cannot make sense of them unless they resort to all kinds of hermeneutical categories to interpret these passages in a convenient way that does not contradict the idea of God as a spiritual, transcendental, omnipotent, omniscient entity. This is where Egoist is born. This is where theology thrives. This is also where the Bible stops making sense. To avoid these problems, we have decided to approach the Bible with a method that does not allow the interpreter to arbitrarily decide when to read the text literally and when to read it allegorically or metaphorically. We are determined to read the Bible literally and, most importantly, to follow what seems to us the only serious and honest approach left when reading the Bible: pretending. Because of the insurmountable contradictions presented above, we are convinced that the only intellectually honest and coherent way to deal with the Old Testament is to pretend that what we read is true in a literal sense. We do not claim that it is true in the theological sense or the sense of absolute truth. We only pretend that it is true as we read it. We believe that when the Bible authors wrote certain things, they meant to say them, not something else. Schliemann comes to our help. He adopted this method against the advice of the whole academic community, but being faithful to it, he was able to find the buried city of Troy. Schliemann's methodological approach has led to acquiring knowledge and a historical archaeological heritage that have remained buried forever. If he had not dared to choose this new and challenging path, we have used and openly declared this same methodology since our studies in this field began. Therefore, as already mentioned, we avoid using these words, hermeneutic categories and interpretations such as allegory or metaphor. As contestable as the methodological stance is, it is the advantage of being clearer than those who resort to vague hermeneutic categories at their discretion. This approach is more consistent with some essential characteristics of Jewish thought, always open to discussion and never tied to definitive interpretations. Within the Jewish community, the need to incessantly analyze and compare the beliefs of individuals has led to the formation of a tradition that thrives on commentary and competing interpretations, that which makes knowledge always precarious, critical, never stable, and aptly expressed by a well-known proverb: one Jew, two opinions; two Jews, five opinions. With a respectful, humble mentality, we try to enter into the freedom of analysis by maintaining clear procedures, original Hebrew text, literal translations, careful selection of quoted passages, but above all, the desire to preserve as much as possible logical coherence in our conclusions. Traditional study systems have led primarily to the development of numerous theologies, often in open and irreconcilable conflict. So without specific and universally valid facts, the interpretation key presented here can be regarded as one of many possible. Let us thus proceed with serenity. Let us pretend the Bible we read is the one originally written. Let us pretend the Bible authors, when they wrote something, wanted to tell us exactly that. Let us pretend the ancient authors left their writings as memory of actual events. Let us pretend that these books can be considered, in essence, as history books. Okay, that was chapter 3, Pretending the Bible Was True. Wow. The next chapter we're going to cover is Elohim. So join me next time.